Okay, so now we know we have a weak body part visually, and we know that we typically would like to address that with training, which we're going to do. But before we do that, are there some boxes that we should check before we really dive in there and start constructing a whole new training program to address it?
So yeah, I think we have to look at the quality of training. I think exercise form and technique, I think that's a big one. And I can speak for myself that the first 20 years of my training, my back training, wasn't very good. Just really didn't get good connection on my back. And the ego got in the way. So I was putting load over form. And that just, basically I had to rely on body English, momentum, to move the weight. So the actual musculature that I was targeting really wasn't doing the majority of the work. And it was actually getting off stage in 2009 after turning pro, where assessing my physique based on the pros I would have to be facing, I realized yes, my back is a weak body part. I need to bring that up. And the first thing I kind of looked at was, how I was executing, and just realized bent over rows a little too upright. So my traps was probably doing the majority of the work. My lower back was assisting a lot. So just cleaning up some of my exercises and shifting the emphasis to the form before the load. That was a game changer in how I was feeling my back. And over time, not really increasing volume or anything like that. It was just focusing on the form. And of course, exercise selection. I think that's another key component that we have to look at, is to make sure the exercises that we're doing, you actually can get good connection on the attended musculature. So those two things was a game changer. And, literally about 2 years later, I saw significant progress with my back. So I think the big thing is, exercise form and technique. That's probably one of the higher priorities.
I don't think we can emphasize quality enough in this discussion, because so you might have a weak point that has kind of always been there, like narrow clavicles, wide waist. But if we're talking about a quote unquote lagging body part, that means you're growing, but it seems to be growing at a slower pace. That is almost always because something is being done in a poorer quality for that muscle group. Like if you're following a symmetrical program, which we'll talk about, and everything is growing well except for your lats, like in Jeff's example, there's probably something off about either the exercises you're choosing, how you're performing them, or your experience of them, or maybe the effort you're putting forth in those exercises that is leading to that shortfall. And adding volume on top of that won't make it better. Like if you were seeing, like Jeff said, say more trap growth, more lower back contribution, and you start doing more volume with that technique that's not accomplishing what you want, you're probably going to get back pain and big traps and not a whole lot else, right, in that example. So you really need to make sure that before you start considering increasing the training stress on a given muscle group, that you're actually effectively training that muscle group. So that's why I think most of the time, the answer is not adding volume. It's assessing, like we have, is there a lagging body part? And then let's make sure that all the efforts I'm currently putting into it are actually efficient and paying off. Because if you skip this step, then it won't solve the problem and it might even make it worse.
So dovetailing on that, Jeff's momentum was a good, it was one of many things on exercise quality that I feel like need to be addressed. How many people do we see in the gym who are doing dumbbell rows and cable rows, and they're not even using their back? They're using their arms, or they're using, like Jeff said, momentum. Basically what I'm getting to is that the range of motion is half of what it should be. And I was guilty of this in my early bodybuilding days, when I would only go to 90-degree elbow flexion on my overhead presses. I was not getting full range of motion, full stretch on my delts. And it wasn't really until I checked my ego, like Jeff said, used lighter dumbbells, started getting a full range of motion, that I actually started feeling my delts more than my triceps. And my upper chest and etc. So I really feel like range of motion cannot be emphasized enough. And yes, we want to train to the range of motion that our bodies can do, but we also want to make sure that we're training to the maximum of that potential of whatever it is that your body can do, pain-free, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like that's an important part of exercise quality as well.
We've got a fair amount of research that suggests that training through a full range of motion does enhance hypertrophy. But the real question that I think is interesting is why? And it's actually not just the total distance covered, but it's exactly what Brad said, is does it put the muscle in a stretched position? Does it actually take the smallest functional unit in a muscle, the sarcomere, and actually put it under a stretch? And that actually seems to enhance muscle growth. We've got a couple of recent studies now where they have trained with partials, but training the partial in either the shortened or the lengthened position. So an example would be doing a bicep curl where you go from full elbow extension up to about halfway up. So the biceps in a stretched position and only doing partials there compared to just doing kind of the top quarter of a bicep curl. And we see much better growth in that lengthened position partial. So it's not necessarily just about range of motion, but making sure that you're actually taking that muscle group through an elongated position and applying high levels of tension to it. And when you think about some of like the videos of the old school IFBB pros, sometimes they're doing partials, but they're doing the right kind of partial. The bar's touching their chest on bench and they're going, 3/4 of the way up. That's the position where all those muscle groups are in a greater stretch position. So instead of just kind of broadly thinking more range of motion good, which I think is a good proxy for long muscle lengths, think about what Brad said. If you're using momentum or cheating in a certain specific range for certain exercises, that can really cut your gains short. And I think back exercises are one of them, where you're at the very initiation of the row when your arms are extended, you use leg drive to get it up. To make sure that you get it all the way to the top position. But that top position is actually where the muscle is shortened. When what you really want is control through that full lengthened position and to increase the range of motion into shoulder extension as far as you can, as just one example. So I think, I fully agree with what Brad said. And the data as it comes out on range of motion and why larger range of motions tend to be more effective for hypertrophy supports exactly what he's saying.
What level of lifter would you say is appropriate to incorporate those type of techniques as far as partials? Like let's say it's someone who's a beginner, doesn't really have the skill going through full range of motion. Is that something like a beginner should be doing? Or is it more catered to intermediate or advanced?
That's a great question, Jeff. And I think to know what it's like to do an effective partial at a long muscle length, you should probably already know what it's like to just have good stock standard traditional full range of motion technique. So I think it is something that needs to be applied to the intermediates and the advanced, and probably not something to go down the rabbit hole with as an early stage lifter, because I think at that stage, if we think of these movements not just as ways to grow, but also as skills, which you should think of them as that way, you don't have the skill development yet to start modifying it, in my opinion. Like an RDL is a great exercise trained through a full range of motion, but most of the time when we see someone perform an RDL, they squat it down a little bit, their knees track forward, they're taking tension off their hamstrings, right? So if they were to do that bottom end of range of motion RDL where they don't come, say, all the way up and fully lock out their glutes, they're kind of doing this weird squatty thing, So it's not even the right exercise at a long muscle length, so they're not going to get the benefits. So to answer your question more directly, definitely this is something for a more experienced bodybuilder to do. And I think for everyone else, you just want to work on using a full range of motion and really making sure that you are feeling the target muscle group active throughout that range of motion.
I think sometimes, and this kind of relates to that, people just pick the wrong movements for them. So like if you're 6'3", short little torso, these long femurs, and you're squatting, like you might not be able to get to those muscle lengths. Like we might need to have you do a Bulgarian split squat or something like that. So sometimes you can just look at someone's program and you're like, oh, you're picking all the stuff that, it's like you're great at deadlifting because say they're put together exactly that way, short little torso, so you're super strong, but it's like you don't have glutes and hamstrings that match up those strength levels, or maybe the front of your legs. So sometimes just readjusting what movements they're using can go a long way, and the quality of stimulus that they're getting is just that much more impactful. So sometimes it's like I've found with people, like sometimes we do less because it's like that muscle hasn't really been trained all that hard when we're talking about like hypertrophy specific training. So they thought we're going to add more, but it's like, no, we just gave you something that kind of fit like a glove, and we're doing fine with like 2/3 of that volume. Sometimes, speaking on the training age of muscle groups, like sometimes, like I know this was the case for me. I just thought I had weak calves. So I'm like, why am I really going to train them like that profusely? So, and they don't, arguably, like they matter, but not that much on the stage, right? We have a lot of world champions who didn't have necessarily like the best calves. So they're a neat muscle group, but nevertheless, it wasn't until year 8 that I started to actually like train like my calves, like really hard and really motivated, and using a lot of the principles that we talk about here so far. So sometimes that does happen, because I think most people, they get into the gym like, hey, I want chest, bro. You know, hey, I want glutes. And maybe that's what they did like the first like 3-5 years. It was most of that. And they've almost developed a sweet tooth for training those body parts, and not necessarily with as much vigor or excitement when it comes to those other areas that like now, you know, they feel they need to bring up. So I think it's something just worth being aware of. It's like, so when I go through how my training developed over the years, like when did I start really paying attention to that body part? When did I really start training it hard in a sensible way? And you might see that, oh, it's like 2 years behind this other body part. So maybe I just don't need to change that much, and I can just kind of sit in the pocket a little bit longer. And now my calves are okay. Like they're not great, but like they're seldomly the weakest on that stage.
And that's actually a perfect lead into what I was going to say, is that once you select the right exercises for your biomechanics, like you realize I have really long arms, so I'm moving like the bar 3 inches when I do sumo deadlifts. Maybe I should do RDLs. And once you realize, you know, I was never actually really training calves. I was just doing 3 sets a week to like a 7 RPE and bouncing around. Like simply fixing that, then you don't need to do anything except keep training, because you basically got a novice muscle group next to an intermediate. The good news is novice muscle groups grow faster, so they'll catch up.